Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I have this kind of habit every time I moderate a talk at Harvard. I say, we gathered in this room are among the luckiest people at Harvard. And I've said this enough times that people now realize that, is he really serious? I am really serious in this case. So we have with us a really extraordinary individual, Dr. Reza Aslan, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's really a best-selling author and one of our primary public intellectuals thinking about the engagement of the West with the Muslim world. I will say that, pretty much everybody in my family, when we want to explain Islam to somebody who is non-Muslim, we always assign them Reza's books. So we've bought several copies of Reza's books for various wives and girlfriends to understand where we're coming from.
That's a great date book.
Yeah. So in addition to this great book that he's written called No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and the Future of Islam, which was a runaway bestseller, he is also the author of How to Win a Cosmic War, Why We're Losing the War on Terror, and Global Jihad, A Theoretical Framework. He's also the founder of a media company, AslanMedia.com, which is one of the best, I find, aggregators of news and opinion on the Middle East. He's actually here today not just to give a talk to this very good-looking and engaged audience, but also to receive an award from one of his alma maters, the Harvard Divinity School. He is the inaugural recipient of the Peter J. Gomez Award, which recognizes outstanding alumni of the Harvard Divinity School. He's also a holder of a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and he's a tenured professor at UC Riverside. Today, he's going to talk to us and enlighten us about the situation in Iran and the potential for conflict between Iran, the United States, and Israel. And I think he's one of the few people who's most well-positioned to talk about both the interstate dynamics and what's happening within Iran. So he's asked to frame this more as a conversation, and so I will try to ask him the questions that a kind of dutiful but not terribly intelligent, B-level Harvard student would ask, which I would have been. I didn't go to Harvard. I had to go to Yale instead for graduate school. So I guess I first want to talk about the nuclear issue. And I guess the first question I want to ask is, so we have these P5+1 talks that are going to start, I think, tomorrow in Almaty. And I guess I want you to give us a sense of how hopeful we should be that something will... Yeah,
right. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on this beautiful day. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm very much looking forward to engaging you guys on this very complex issue. And whatever else you want to talk about. I'm here till 5:30, so we can talk about anything you want to. Well, this is actually, so tomorrow, or today, I think tomorrow, is the second round of this particular series of talks that are taking place in Kazakhstan. The first round was unique in that it was the first time. Now, obviously, we've been talking about this for a long time. We've been saying that, should we negotiate with Iran or should we bomb Iran? What's the way forward? And you've heard those who advocate a more military agenda have repeatedly said that negotiations aren't getting anywhere. We're not getting anywhere with negotiations, by which they mean that Iran has not completely halted its uranium enrichment program. Well, that's true, but I do want to sort of emphasize one very important fact. The last meeting of the P5+1, the one that took place about a month ago, which was maybe the 12th or 13th meeting in which we've been negotiating with the Iranians, was the first time ever that the P5+1 actually offered Iran something for stopping its enrichment program. Now think about that for one moment. We have never, ever put anything on the table in exchange for Iran suspending its program until a month ago. And it turns out that in a negotiation, when you actually offer something in exchange for something else, it tends to get the ball rolling. So I do feel, in that regard, much more optimistic about the second round of these negotiations that are about to take place. By the way, what we offered, just to be clear, was in exchange for three things from Iran. Number one, a complete shutdown of the so-called Fordo facility. This is the what most people think, most experts think, is a primarily military installation. One of Iran's many installations for the enrichment of uranium, a suspension of all enrichment at 20%, which is the highest level that Iran has achieved so far. 20%, of course, is the necessary percentage of enrichment for medical isotopes, which is what Iran claims that it needs its enrichment program for. And then third, the shipping out of Iran the majority of the enriched uranium that it already has on hand. In exchange for that, the United States, and the P5+1, I should say, have offered a slight rolling back of the sanctions that have been in place. Again, it's a very small offer, but it's the first offer we've ever made. Iran has been mulling this over the last month, and that's what the second meeting is all about, to sort of get Iran's response. Now, I can tell you what Iran's response is going to be. It's going to be no, of course. That's how any good negotiation works, but it's certainly how negotiations in the Middle East work. If anyone has traveled in the Middle East and tried to buy a scarf or anything, as you know, this is a long process, and it only ends when somebody walks away and the other person starts saying, my friend, please come back. No, my friend, I give you a good price. So we're a long way from I give you a good price. Now, so in that regard, I'm optimistic. Okay? But here's the reality check. Iran is in the midst of probably the most fractious period in its history, more so than even in 2009. The government is tearing itself apart. The president has been going after the Speaker of the Parliament. The Parliament has tried on 3 separate occasions to impeach the president. The members of the executive branch have openly questioned why we even need a supreme leader, and why, and the fact that to put it in a direct quote from Ahmadinejad himself, that, quote, the governance of the Islamic Republic is too complex a thing to be left in the hands of the religious clerics, end quote, which is an interesting statement because that's actually the definition of the Islamic Republic. And then, of course, the supreme leader has recently opined about why we even need a president. And maybe we should just go back to the old days when we had a prime minister. In this particular environment, with elections coming up in June, just 3 months from now, there is very little chance that we are going to get any kind of a firm answer from Iran. So there's not going to be any kind of major breakthrough in this round of discussions, but the very fact that we are now moving forward, something has been offered, there's room now for Iran to come back with a counter-offer, which it certainly will, and then this process will continue until after the elections. And I think really after the elections, depending on how that goes, you're going to see an Iran that's in a better place to make a serious offer in these sort of ongoing negotiations. So that's where we are now. Cautiously optimistic, but nothing is really going to happen of substance until after June.
So to kind of think about the underlying dynamics of this very complicated situation. So as you pointed out, this is the first time we've ever made an offer to the Iranians, and it seems from your description that this is a pretty paltry offer to begin with. And so my question is, given that I assume that, folks in the U.S. administration, the P5+1 more generally, are not idiots and they understand how negotiations work, why has it taken so long to come up with a credible offer? And why is the offer one that you think nobody in Iran is really going to be in a position to accept anyway?
It's a very good question. Well, the first part, so why has it taken this long to come up with an actual offer? I mean, this is, people in the foreign policy realm, and particularly my colleagues at the Council, have been advocating making a serious offer for years, but very little has happened. And I think there's two reasons for it. First of all, there's so much dissension in the administration about how to deal with Iran in the first place. And there's obviously an enormous amount of complexity with trying to manage America's interests with regard to Iran and Israel's interests with regard to Iran. I don't need to tell you that over the last year, Israeli interests, and certainly the so-called Israeli red line, which seems to change every 5 or 6 months, has been really the dominant rhetoric of the administration itself. In many ways, actually, President Obama has just simply absorbed Netanyahu's rhetoric about the red lines that we're willing to tolerate in Iran. And so you gradually heard over the last 18 months or so the president go from using words like, we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, to, as he said, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks before the elections, to we will not allow Iran to develop the technology to develop nuclear weapons, or we will not allow Iran to develop nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapon capabilities. These are Israeli terms. This is Netanyahu's words. By the way, Iran already has nuclear weapons capabilities. I mean, that's the kind of the joke of all this. Everybody already understands that if Iran wanted to build a nuclear weapon, it could. There's nothing stopping Iran from doing so. But the one thing that all of the intelligence estimates that we have agree on, whether it's America's or Europe's or even Israel's even Israeli intelligence all agrees on, is that thus far, Iran has yet to make the political decision to pursue weaponization of its nuclear program. Should it decide to do so, if it wants to do so, it could very easily, and then estimates vary, anywhere between 6 to 12 months after Iran kicks out the IAEA inspectors, which we should not forget are actually in Iran, breaks all the UN seals from their centrifuges, which we should all remember, all have UN seals on them, the ones that we know of to be fair, and then races headlong towards a nuclear weapon. Probably 6 to 12 months is how long it would take. But the issue is they've yet to do that. That's a little bit of a tangent, excuse me. So the first thing is that there's been a lot of dissension in the administration about how to actually deal with Iran. But the second thing, and I think more important thing, is that over the last 16, 17 months, which has really been the bulk of the negotiations, the serious negotiations with Iran and the P5+1, our president has been running for office, has been running for re-election. It's been a very long campaign. And as a result, could not be put in a position to give Iran what is necessary to actually move the negotiations forward. What is necessary to move negotiations forward? Well, actually, Barack Obama said it pretty well when he was running for president in 2008, as he told the New York Times. He said that he would negotiate with Iran bilaterally, and as he put it, without conditions. And he said back then, this is when he was still running against Hillary Clinton, I should say, he said back then that what the first step in a serious negotiation with Iran is an unapologetic public recognition of Iran's right to enrich uranium under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is still waiting for that statement. It may seem a small thing, but in the world of diplomacy, it is not. A statement from the president, a public statement, that Iran has every right to enrich uranium to its heart's content, is an important first step for Iran, and it's one that the president could not have made over the last 18 months without suffering severe political consequences for it. Now that the elections are over, and you see all of a sudden the very first time in which American diplomats met with Iran post the elections, they offered something. They offered something small, but they offered something, and they know that it's the first round. It's going to take many, many more rounds. But I think that's instructive, that we waited until he was reelected before we actually bothered to say, here's what we're willing to give you.
But, your point was that the president had said this when he was running in 2008.
Yes.
So what changed? In other words, if this
Being
is...
president?
Yeah. So what about being president? I mean, do you get access to new information that causes you to think that, well, maybe...
I mean, I'm not privy to the national security meetings that they have, so maybe that's the case. Maybe he is getting some information that the rest of us simply do not have access to. I sort of doubt it. I think we all know what the issue is. It's just sort of raw politics. I think being in the position that he was in and pursuing the policy on the international stage that he decided to pursue in 2008, in which he went to Cairo and he started talking about reaching out to the Muslim world. He began to really threaten the blanket support that the United States gives to some of its allies in the Arab world. Many of those allies are no longer around, as many of you know. And then he began opening up to Iran pretty well, actually, right away. If you recall, he had that very famous speech where he said that, that if Iran unclenches its fist, that the United States is willing to reach out with an open hand. And I think in 2008, early 2009, there was an enormous amount of optimism in the United States that we could have constructive dialogue with Iran. And then, of course, the 2009 election in Iran happened, the Green Revolution happened, and that put an end to any kind of conversation that Iran was willing to have with the United States, not the other way around. Iran was dealing with, obviously, a homegrown revolution. It was not in a place where it could feel confident enough to negotiate over something so delicate as its nuclear program. By the time you get to 2010 and 2011, you're in the situation where the re-election campaign has already begun, and negotiations with Iran were very much on the back burner. And then, of course, again, it's the raw politics of it. Already, President Obama had been severely and unfairly criticized by the Republicans for, quote-unquote, throwing Israel under the bus. And we can talk about whether that was a valid criticism of him or not. But in that kind of a situation, and with this unprecedented obstructionism, I mean, it's this intrusion of the Prime Minister of Israel into America's presidential elections. It just was. There was no room. There was no political room to maneuver for the president to actually make any kind of good faith negotiation offer to Iran that wouldn't come with severe political consequences. So I think it was just bad timing. I mean, when he sort of started the Iran process, Iran underwent a revolution. By the time things calmed down enough in Iran to restart serious negotiations, he was undergoing his own re-election. Now that he has been elected, Iran is undergoing its own election. So we're in this awkward situation where the timing never seems to be right. But hopefully, some of that will settle down a little bit after June.
So I guess a sort of prior question to all of this is, what exactly exercises us so much about a nuclear Iran?
Yes.
So when you talk to some U.S. policymakers, they will frame it in terms of the NPT, that what we really are trying to defend here is this international framework, the NPT, and if the Iranians violate it, this is bad for this kind of big international institution. Others will frame it in terms of the belief that the Iranians are fundamentally irrational and might use these weapons in some way. Certainly that's how the Israeli discourse is. And yet others will say simply, well, this will increase Iranian power in the region. And
right.
So certainly if we look at some of the discourse that we've seen from Ahmadinejad, etc., it would lend some support to this view that, in fact, the Iranians are somewhat irrational or might use this to bad ends. Why is that? You clearly don't agree with that.
Yeah, very good, very good. Let's talk about these. There are, I think, essentially 5 reasons why the world, particularly the P5+1, is so adamant about making sure Iran does not develop nuclear weapons capability. So let's talk about these for a moment, because these reasons have been dissected repeatedly by think tanks, by scholars, by academics, by experts in the region. So there's no shortage of answers to these things. Let's start with the most absurd, which is that Iran is the only country on the planet in which nuclear deterrence would not work. That they are, in the words of Netanyahu, a fundamentalist death cult, and that the first thing that they will do when they finally get a nuclear weapon, the first thing that they will do is that they will commit collective suicide with it by launching it against Israel. I remember in 2008 at a council meeting where the foreign policy advisor to then nominee John McCain put it this way. He said, "You have to think of Iran as the national equivalent of a suicide bomber." Those were his exact words. The national equivalent of a suicide bomber. I could sit here and make a lot of discussions about this, but I just want to be as blunt about this as possible. If you are sitting in this room, and if you think that Iran wants a nuclear weapon so that it could launch it against Israel, and by the way, wipe out Lebanon, Palestine, and and most of Jordan in doing so, and in return be turned to glass by Israel, because Israel has at least 50 nuclear weapons pointed directly at Tehran as we speak. If that's what you think, you're an imbecile. Okay? You're a moron. You don't have a place in the discussion. You should not be allowed in the debate.
Can I interrupt you though, just to ask you a prior question? Do you think he believes that, or do you think it's a bit of political rhetoric that he thinks will play? Yes. Does he really believe this, in your view?
Bibi can't eat cereal without it being a political act. Everything he does, everything he says, the air that he breathes is political. So he may actually believe it. He may, deep down in his heart, actually believe it, and that's fine. But I just want to say that everything that he does is political. But it's not just Bibi who says this. You hear this in the United States a lot. I mean, you hear it from some fairly rational people in the United States. Iran wants a nuclear weapon for the same reason that every nation on earth who's ever pursued nuclear weapons wants one, as a defense mechanism, as a deterrent against an attack. I mean, let's face it, from Iran's perspective, from our perspective, an Iran with a nuclear weapon would be a disaster. It'd be a national security disaster for the region for a number of reasons that we can talk about. But the fact of the matter is that as we sit here right now, Iran is literally, and by the way, when I say literally, I mean literally. I don't mean it the way my students mean it, by which they mean figuratively. I mean literally encircled by American troops. We have drawn a circle of American military might around the nation of Iran, including 3 destroyers in the Persian Gulf. So, yes, Iran is a threat to America's national security interests. There's no question about that. But from the Iranian perspective, America is a threat to its national security. We're having open conversations about when we should bomb Iran. Should it be the summer? Summer's a good time. We actually have these conversations. And Iran watches CNN. They know what's happening. Again, Netanyahu has repeatedly talked about, the bombing campaign about Iran is going to start any minute now. Iran understands that the only way to truly ward off the possibility of an attack is if it has a nuclear deterrent. I used to say this a long time ago. It's been so long since we used these terms, but Iran learned a pretty valuable lesson from its fellow Axis of Evil members, right? The one without nuclear weapons was destroyed and occupied. The one with nuclear weapons, we're still throwing billions of dollars at them just to get them to sort of talk to us about their program. So let's just keep that in mind. So that's the first argument, and it doesn't even require a response, that argument. The second argument is that an Iran with nuclear weapons would launch a nuclear arms race in the region. That one seems a little bit more rational until you start to break it down. And by the way, the New America Foundation has written a very, very good report on this that has completely debunked it, and I think you could Google it. The issue here is that an Iran with nuclear weapons means that Saudi Arabia would have nuclear weapons, and then that Turkey would have nuclear weapons because they feel threatened by Iran's nuclear weapons. Again, on the surface, that seems like a rational argument, but actually it is not a rational argument. First of all, if Turkey wanted nuclear weapons, they'd have nuclear weapons. Iran is not the thing that's keeping Turkey from developing a nuclear weapon. The other countries in the region, say Egypt or what have you, and certainly Saudi Arabia, they are so utterly dependent on their relationship with the United States that the fear of actually threatening that relationship is enough of a deterrent about developing nuclear weapons capability that I think that we can more or less, I mean, maybe not completely debunk the notion. It may possibly happen, but it's incredibly unlikely. So the nuclear arms race one. The third argument that's often made is that Iran will sell its nukes, that it'll develop a nuclear weapon and then it'll just, sell it to Al-Qaeda, and then the next thing you know, it'll show up here as a dirty bomb. Again, on the surface, seems like a rational argument, and certainly, the notion of a nuclear, black market is one that is, talked about a lot in foreign policy circles and anti-proliferation circles. Again, it's an incredibly unlikely thing. The notion of, and Joe Cirincione, by the way, who is the head of the Ploughshares Fund, an organization that I'm a board member of, and anti-nuclear proliferation fund, wrote a wonderful book about this called Bomb Scare. It turns out that it's actually much, much more difficult than you see on movies to put a nuclear weapon in a suitcase and hand it off to some crazy Arab and have that Arab, get on a boat and arrive in New York with it. The monitoring that we do for these suspected nuclear materials is actually pretty complete. So again, is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. Is it unlikely? Yes, it's very unlikely.
What about the Pakistani precedent there, the AQ Khan network?
Right. So what AQ Khan did is he didn't sell nuclear weapons. What he did is he sold nuclear technology. What he sold was know-how, right?
Which the Iranians could presumably do now if they wanted to.
You could get it online now if you wanted to. It's not a joke. Any third-year physics student at the science lab could build a nuclear weapon with the materials necessary. AQ Khan, that was a different world. But you could just Google how to build a nuclear weapon. Don't do that, by the way, because I'm not sure that that's a good idea. 1, 2, 3. Was that 4? Yeah, that was 4. No, that was 3. The fourth one is that an Iran with nuclear capability would alter the balance of power in the Middle East. That one is absolutely true. Right now, Israel is sort of the nuclear behemoth in the Middle East, and it sort of preserves its power in the region precisely because of its nuclear deterrence. Now, so if an Iran has a nuclear weapons, then that balance would alter dramatically. By the way, that's a very good argument for Iran to have nuclear weapons. Now, there is a sort of an ancillary argument to this particular view, which is that it's the argument of the so-called nuclear umbrella. And this is how this argument goes. Let's say Iran has a nuclear weapon, and Hezbollah launches missiles into northern Israel, and Israel responds or wants to respond, but then it can't respond because if it responds, then Iran, Hezbollah's patron, will sort of use its nuclear umbrella to protect Hezbollah, and Israel would be limited in its response for fear of Iran's nuclear weapons. Again, when you say these words, it sort of makes sense until you start to break it down for a moment. And all of a sudden you realize that a nuclear weapon is not an umbrella, right? It's not a targeted weapon. It's not something that you sort of, you take out some communications buildings in Tel Aviv with. So again, the argument, I think, really stretches the imagination. But nevertheless, it is true that it would alter the balance. The fifth and final reason, and in my view, the only sort of legitimate, reasonable reason to do everything in our power to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, is that it would spell the end of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That would be it. This is a treaty that, by the way, is already on life support. For those of you unfamiliar with the NPT, essentially what it says is that there are 5 countries in the world who get to have nuclear weapons and nobody else does. That's what it says. Obviously, that is not the case any longer. India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, all of them not signatories to the NPT. All of them have nuclear weapons. And worse, the NPT forbids countries that have signed on to the NPT from dealing with countries who have nuclear weapons who haven't signed on to it. Obviously, that's not the case with regard to Israel. The United States completely protects Israel's nuclear arsenal, but more importantly, if you recall, in 2006 or 2007, I may be getting the year wrong, we signed a landmark nuclear trade deal with India. India, of course, has illegal nuclear weapons, in which now we are providing India with nuclear technology that can be used both for civilian purposes and for military purposes. This is an interesting point because Article 1 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we wrote, Article 1 says that no signatory of this treaty is allowed to engage in nuclear trade with any non-signatory of this treaty. So the fact that we have just completely ignored that and are in direct violation of a treaty that we've written, plus the fact that we have 4 nuclear nations that are outside of the treaty, has already taken this very important document, which is the only serious anti-proliferation document that we have, and turned it into scrap paper. If Iran is allowed to develop nuclear weapons, that's it for the anti-proliferation regime. We would really have to start all over again, which may not be the worst thing, but nevertheless, that I think is, at least in my view, as a decades-long advocate of anti-proliferation, that's the biggest reason to make sure that Iran, or for that matter, any other country, keeps from developing nuclear weapons.
So I want to open this up for questions shortly, but I do want to get us to talk a little bit about the internal situation. And it seems to me the first question would be, when we're negotiating with Iran,
who are we negotiating
Who are we
with?
talking
Yeah.
to? Are we talking to Ahmadinejad, or are we talking to the supreme leader? I mean, who is Iran in this?
So, I mean, you're right. I mean, this is, honestly, we're not sure. The easy answer, of course, and the answer that if you were going to guess, if this were Jeopardy and it was Final Jeopardy and you put all your money in and you had to say something, you would say the supreme leader. You would say Ayatollah
who is
Khamenei.
the supreme leader?
Who is the supreme leader? Yes, that's right. And that's not a bad answer, because in Iran's incredibly complex political structure, in the end, the buck stops with the supreme leader. Here's the problem with that answer, however, is that this is not your dad's supreme leader. The not just Khamenei himself, the current supreme leader, but the very office, the role of the supreme leader, has deteriorated immensely over the last 2 decades. First of all, this is I should mention, this is a function, an office that was created by Khomeini for Khomeini. I don't think Khomeini ever thought anybody else would have this job. But in the very act of replacing Khomeini with Khamenei, so the office of supreme leader, it's complex Shia theology, but essentially the simplest way of putting it is that in the absence of the Mahdi, in the absence of the Shia Messiah, whose job is to come back to earth and create the perfect society, in the absence of him and that perfect society, it is the job of his representatives, the Ayatollahs, to build that society for him, and when that society reaches perfection, he will come back. Complex Shia millenarianism. The argument for the Walayat al-Faqih, which is the political conception that gave birth to the Islamic Republic, the guardianship of the jurist, is that instead of all of the Ayatollahs being in charge, that doesn't make any sense. What it should be is the most qualified Ayatollah. So the highest Ayatollah should be the person in charge. And that person should be endowed with both religious and political authority. His political authority is such that he has veto power over all laws. He can dismiss the president. He can dissolve parliament. Most importantly, he's the commander-in-chief of the military. This was a good job for Khomeini. I mean, he's the guy who came up with this entire idea. He's the one who came up with Shia millenarianism. It's a kind of a theologically innovative, really brilliant notion, insofar as, those of us who are, theology geeks and who get excited about these kinds of things. It's a brilliant innovation in 14 centuries of Shia thought. No one had ever said anything like this before. No one had ever thought anything like this before. It's a very interesting thought, and it worked. It actually, he actually was able to create it. Before he died, however, he handpicked this low to mid-level cleric who wasn't even an Ayatollah, let alone the highest Ayatollah, Khamenei, the present, to take the place, because he thought, if I have someone who has the stature that I have, he may change things. Right? He may just, dissolve this entire thing. And indeed, most of the grand ayatollahs in Iran, whether it's Mortazavi or whether it's Sana'i, most of these guys reject the very concept of the Walayat al-Faqih and have argued and written against it. So he picked some low, mid-level cleric to become the infallible, unconditional leader of Iran. So right there, 20 years ago, the seed was set for the slow dissolution of this office. But in the meantime, over the last couple of decades in which he's held this office, what we've seen is his power slowly descend from this one place, from this one position of unconditional authority, into these Orwellian subcommittees that have been formed, whether it's the Assembly of Experts or the Guardian Council or what have you, whose job is to facilitate the movement of authority between the elected government and the unelected government, but who, in the process of that facilitation, have just kind of held on to it themselves in many ways. So that has lessened some of his authority. But the thing that has most greatly lessened the Supreme Leader's authority is the rise of the Revolutionary Guard as an independent political faction in Iran. The reason that the 79 revolution worked is because ultimately, when the Shah ordered his military to open fire, they said no. Ultimately, they put down their guns and they joined the revolution, and that's all she wrote. And as grateful as Khomeini was to the military for turning against their commander, he knew that if they did it once, they would do it again. So he created a shadow military called the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard was essentially founded to be the Supreme Leader's personal militia. That's really how it began. But in the 30-odd years in which it has existed, and certainly since Khomeini's death, the Revolutionary Guard has become something that's very difficult to describe. I guess the best way that I could put it is that imagine if the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI became a single organization in the United States. That's the Revolutionary Guard. So they are the chief intelligence organization, but they're also the chief security organization. And since 2009, that security has now devolved into domestic security as well as international security issues. So they've become enormously powerful on the political scene, but at the same time, they have become a huge economic powerhouse. They are essentially a mafia. That's really the best way of describing the Revolutionary Guard. And I mean that quite in a quite literal sense. I mean, they run the entire concrete industry, for instance, in Iran. So if you need concrete, and for any kind of building material, chances are you have to purchase your concrete from some Revolutionary Guard front-owned business. They own most of the telecommunications industry in Iran. They own the rubber business in Iran. They're enormously wealthy, hugely powerful, and over the last decade or so, they've begun to run for office. So there are something like a third of the parliament are former Revolutionary Guard members. Ahmadinejad himself is the very first former Revolutionary Guard member to become president. He was a very low-ranking Revolutionary Guard member. That's important to keep in mind. But nevertheless, it's the first time that a member of the Revolutionary Guard became president. And by the way, the 2009 stealing of the election was a military coup. It was the Revolutionary Guard that engineered that election fraud. So a lot of people say that Khamenei was behind it, and that the fact that he acted shocked that people could possibly think that the election was stolen. No, that's just how out of touch he is. He really doesn't know what's happening. So now you have all these different factions, all these different power centers, and this quasi-military security apparatus that are increasingly acting independently of the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader himself is becoming an older man, a more isolated man. And since 2009, the one thing that he enjoyed before 2009, the one thing that he held his hat on, is that he presented himself as this kind of neutral arbiter. That was his role. He was the mediator amongst all of these factions, so that when he spoke with authority. When he said enough, people listened. When he said this guy is right and that guy is wrong, people listened. As much as the Iranians themselves may hate the very system upon which they relied, they still nevertheless saw the Supreme Leader as sort of the fair arbiter amongst these different groups. That completely changed in 2009. When for the first time in he's been Supreme Leader for 20 years, he decides that this is the moment that he is going to change course, when he completely stepped into the fray and decided for himself, what was right, what was wrong, who won and who didn't win, and threatened the Iranian people with their lives unless they went home. That was the end of that. So he's lost a lot of his power, he's lost his prestige, he's lost his position. So goes back to the answer. If you have to say something, if you have to answer that question and you only get one answer, the answer is the Supreme Leader. But again, it's not as clear cut as it used to be.
So this is interesting. You've described an internal Iranian situation that has a couple of big cleavages. The first is between the elected and the unelected. But then within this electoral realm, we know that presidential elections are coming up. Who are the main players here? Who would we look at as the Revolutionary Guard's candidate, and what are the other countervailing forces?
Yes.
And do these players have different preferences with regard to the nuclear program?
The answer is no. Mm-hmm. So the second question is easy. No. Simple. Everybody in Iran, from the leftist lefty to the rightist righty, every one of them agree that Iran has an inalienable right to enrich uranium to its heart's content. Okay? Everyone believes that.
What about with regard to weaponization?
With regard to weaponization, that becomes a very complex thing, because then you're talking about the Revolutionary Guard, who, after all, are the people in control. The politics is going to be decided by Khamenei, who has issued fatwa after fatwa, condemning the possibility of using nuclear weapons. We can talk about whether you should pay any attention to those fatwas, but that's another issue. But the Revolutionary Guard are military guys, and military guys are the same all over the world. All they care about is who has the biggest gun. That's all they care about. So if, we were able to, say, take the upper echelon of the Revolutionary Guard and poll them secretly about whether they would want a nuclear weapon, I would guess that the majority would say, absolutely, we want a nuclear weapon, and we want it right now, because that's how they think. They don't get to make that decision, but nevertheless, that's how they think. For the most part, however, the widespread consensus amongst the clerics, amongst the regime, amongst the conservatives, amongst the so-called pragmatists, amongst the rise of these nationalists that have come up and circled themselves around Ahmadinejad, and the reformists, is that Iran doesn't want nuclear weapons, but it should be able to enrich uranium as much as it wants to. So what are these different factions right now? Well, you have to think of them in sort of a cluster of about 4 or 5 different groups. I already mentioned the reformists. The reformists themselves are pretty much a dead entity when it comes to politics. Okay, when it comes to having they're about as vital as the Israeli left. They're like the Meretz party in Israel. They're never going to get more than 2 seats in the parliament. That's the same thing with the reform movement, mainly because the natural constituency of the reform movement has given up on the political process. So the people who would normally vote for them aren't voting anymore, so they wouldn't vote for anybody. So the reform movement is still there. They'll probably run a candidate. It might be someone like Moin, or it might be Karoubi again. Although there's no way they're going to allow him to run, since he's under house arrest. But someone from that faction will run again, but it'll just be symbolic. And then you have this so-called pragmatist faction. And I guess if I were to, and I'm just going to throw out, leaders. They may not be sort of what anyone would refer to as official leaders of this group, but they're at least people you've heard of before, and that'll give you a sense of what I mean when I say pragmatist. So the pragmatist camp, I would sort of put someone like Ali Akbar Rafsanjani in that camp, who is now, by the way, Ayatollah Rafsanjani. Ayatollah Rafsanjani, we put him in the pragmatist camp. The pragmatists believe that the notion of self-sustainment, which has been the heart of the Iranian ethos, the revolutionary ethos, which is that we can sustain ourselves. We don't need the rest of the world. We can just be isolated and contained, and it won't matter, and we can sort of sustain this system ourselves. The pragmatists don't believe that anymore. The pragmatists look at the economic situation and they say, this is a disaster. The country's on the verge of economic collapse. That unless we figure out a way to open up and have access to the free market, that we're never going to survive. And the pragmatists tend to be more upper class. Rafsanjani happens to be the richest Iranian, maybe in the world, I think, but he's certainly the richest Iranian in Iran. Forbes puts his family fortune at about $1 billion. Utterly corrupt. He's a totally corrupt businessman. I mean, that's not weird. Most everybody is corrupt in Iran, and certainly you cannot raise $1 billion without being corrupt. I mean, the economic machinery is incapable of generating $1 billion in personal revenue without corruption. It's just not possible. And so, a lot of people, and of course, he's original revolutionary. He's got a lot of blood on his hands. But nevertheless, for a lot of reformists who have given up on the reform movement, the pragmatists and Rafsanjani are their best hope, because at the very least, he's got the power and the influence necessary, and the connections. By the way, he's got a lot of good friends amongst the Republicans in the Congress still from his Iran-Contra days, to actually affect substantial change in Iran, but not as president.
I think he's understood now the limitations of the office of president, which has grown a lot, certainly under Ahmadinejad, but it's still an incredibly limited office. Rafsanjani wants to be supreme leader. That's what he wants to be, which is why I said Ayatollah Rafsanjani, because something interesting happened in 2010. For those of you unfamiliar with the way Shiism works, it's a very hierarchical religious structure, and there's the Grand Ayatollah and then the Ayatollahs. There is no mechanism whereby you move from one level to the next. In other words, you don't get a diploma. You don't pass a test and go to the next station. The poetic way that it's sometimes said is how many people pray behind you when you pray. That's the poetic way. But there isn't somebody actually counting, and once you reach 10,000, they're like, oh, you're an Ayatollah. It's just consensus. People start calling you Ayatollah. That's what happens. Something very interesting happened. So in 2009, as you recall, Rafsanjani joined the reform movement. His daughter and his son were both repeatedly jailed as part of the Green Movement. And he himself was attacked viciously by the government. And then he sort of quieted down. Then he just kind of stepped back. And a lot of people said, oh, Rafsanjani completely betrayed the reform movement. He's the one person who could have really done something, really tipped the balance. And instead, he just sort of went back into his house and gave up. And he did it because they threatened him. They threatened his money. They threatened his family. All that, by the way, is true. But for those of us who, read the tea leaves in Iran, something happened in 2010 that made so much sense. The government newspapers, the newspapers that are most tightly controlled by the government, started referring to Rafsanjani as Ayatollah Rafsanjani. Now, Rafsanjani is a member of the Assembly of Experts. This is the assembly that gets to choose the next supreme leader when Khamenei dies. And he was, until quite recently, the chair of the Assembly of Experts. And these are just 82 guys who decide amongst themselves. They're not going to. It's like if the cardinals decide some parish priest is going to be pope. That's not going to happen. They're going to decide amongst the people in that room which one of them gets to be pope. It's the same thing. The Assembly of Experts, they're going to pick one of them to be the next supreme leader, and that person has to be an Ayatollah. And I think what you saw there is this kind of understanding amongst Rafsanjani and perhaps people centered around Khamenei. A lot of bad blood between Khamenei and Rafsanjani, always has been, about this sort of possibility. So I think Rafsanjani is, despite the blood on his hands, despite his utter corruption, is really the best answer for Iran. And were he to be the supreme leader, that would be a titanic change in Iran, equivalent to a revolution. So the pragmatists. Then there's this new crowd that I was referring to before. This very, very new crowd that has arisen over the last 4 or 5 years. And the best way to think of them, sometimes they're referred to as the nationalists. This is the Ahmadinejad crowd. This is the Mashai crowd. This is a crowd that has been saying for a very, very long time that the very foundation of the government is broken. That just because you spend 12 years at the Fezzieh learning Quranic exegesis doesn't mean you are qualified to run the economy of this country. And more than that, that there's a stink of the worst thing you can call someone in Iran is an Arab. There's a stink of Arabism to what Iran has become, by which they mean, radically religious is what they mean by that. And that for Iran to truly regain its position, as a regional and global power, it needs to have its Iranian identity surge and its Islamic identity decline. And so you've heard a lot of speeches by both Ahmadinejad and Mashai, his chief of staff, who Ahmadinejad is grooming to become the next president. We can talk about that. But you've heard a lot of speeches about them talking about Iranian culture, Iranian heritage, Iranian nationalism. And it's also clever politicking, by the way, because this is how the youth feel. The Iranian youth are sick and disgusted by Islam, and they are utterly absorbed by Iran's pre-Islamic past because it's been denied them. So this is a very clever way, but these nationalists are trying to tap into a different structure to kind of compel Iran forward. And then there's the group that we would sort of refer to as the conservatives, I suppose is the best way of putting that. And I guess right now the head of that party, he's not really the head of the party, but the person that would be most likely to be the candidate that represents that group is the Speaker of the House, Ali Larijani. Larijani is very, very close to Khamenei, and he is Khamenei's preferred candidate. I think he's probably going to be the next president of Iran. And I think Khamenei is going to make sure that there's no more. What happened in 2009 is never going to happen again, as far as he's concerned. And so it's going to be a much smoother election, much more openly fake election, as opposed to in 2009. And I think Ali Larijani will probably become the president. And that conservative faction, which really controls the parliament right now, will then also control the executive.
Wow.
That's a very simplistic breakdown. And that's why I said they're not factions, they're clusters. Think of them as clusters. But that's the best way to understand it from the American perspective.
So I want to actually open it up for questions. I'll just ask you one last thing, answered maybe in a second. So regardless of what happens with the presidential election, it sounds like you don't think that any outcome makes war more or less likely, or that the outcome of that election could actually impact what happens.
Here is the great irony of all this. What's probably going to happen is that Iran will have a fake election. Ali Larijani will become the president. The conservatives, aligned with Khamenei, will then dominate every aspect of the government, from the unelected to all three branches of the elected. They control the judiciary, they control the parliament, they don't control the executive, but they will control the executive. Once that happens, Khamenei will have essentially solidified, at least in a symbolic way, his control over every lever of the government. It'll be a disaster for the people of Iran. It'll be fantastic for negotiations. Because right now, Khamenei is not in a position to negotiate because he's not in a position of strength. He is dealing with a country that is more fractious than it has ever been since the 79 revolution. He, as unsure as we are of who's in charge, that's how unsure he is of who's in charge. If that could be taken away, if he could have the confidence of knowing, okay, all of my people are in their place, I have total control over this country and this government, the reform movement has been utterly silenced, now I'm ready to negotiate. So that's a great irony. Bad for Iran, good for America, weirdly, with regard to negotiations.